We'll get started, and I'll just repeat that. Welcome to the Office of Child Care's Federal Fiscal Year 2023 Quality Progress Report training for states and territories. My name is Francesca Wolf, and I am a member of Program Operations in the Office of Child Care. My co-presenter today will be Sam Reinstein from our Region 1 office, and also Rosa Williams from our GDIT team. Want to thank the QPR work group for all their hard work on this training, and we will get started. So some logistical housekeeping items. In case you have any trouble through accessing or with the chat, with anything at the moment, feel free to email Violetta Mora, icf.com, or message the host. You can use the chat. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. We do ask at this time, if you keep yourselves on mute, you should all be muted, and there will be time for questions. So we've got a lot to cover today. I'm gonna jump right in and apologize if I go quickly. And this broadcast is being recorded and will be posted on the OCC website. So what we'll cover today is general information about the QPR, detailed information on the sections of the QPR, key dates around training and submission using CARS, and if there is time, frequently asked questions. After this training, these slides and recording will be posted on the OCC website. On the same page, the links that you received in the OCC announcement to register for this training. So we will be skipping over some of the slides in this presentation today in the interest of time, but we've included them all in the presentation for your reference when completing the QPR. We will be scheduling office hours for early November, and an updated announcement will be sent to all lead agencies with all of these links and the office hours date once that's decided. So what is the Quality Progress Report? For those of you who might be new, it's a description of activities that were funded with quality expenditures. It's a mechanism to evaluate progress in improving the quality of childcare programs services, and it's the annual report for states and territories to describe how CCDF quality funds were expended in line with the requirements of the CCDBG Act. The Quality Progress Report collects basic information on the population of providers in the state or territory, on each of the 10 authorized uses from the CCDBG Act. It asks for estimated spending amounts from CCDF, and very key here is also non-CCDF sources. So we're not only asking you about CCDF in the Quality Progress Report, the QPR also collects information on non-CCDF sources. That's something to remember throughout this presentation. And finally, it collects information on progress updates since the last QPR submission. OCC uses the QPR to ensure accountability for use of CCDF quality funds, including the Infant Toddler Set-Aside and Stabilization Grants funded by the ARP Act, to track progress towards state and territory set indicators and benchmarks for improving childcare based on goals stated in their CCDF plans, to inform TA efforts around the use of quality funds, and to understand progress towards all childcare settings meeting the developmental needs of children. States and territories have a number of other data submissions that they include for Office of Child Care, including the CCDF plan. And in the plan, this is where you tell us how and which of the 10 authorized uses you will be spending funds towards. And importantly, you identify how you're going to track your own progress towards meeting goals towards these allowable uses. So therefore, then in the QPR, each year, we ask you to show progress on those measures that you identified in the plan. And it's used to quantify the benefits of CCDF quality improvement funds and collect information on activities using across the broad spectrum of COVID funding. Both of these are used in conjunction with the ACF 901, which is the provider level information on ARP stabilization grants. And then finally, you also submit the ACF 696, which identifies exactly how much is spent on quality activities. So when you're thinking about what data you might need to fill out the quality progress report, the QPR, you're going to need data specifically from federal fiscal year 2023 or October 1st, 2022 through September 30th, 2023. Throughout the QPR, we're looking for cumulative totals for the fiscal year, unless it's otherwise stated. And we're looking for any data that you have related to CCDF requirements or quality improvement activities. And this can either be data that is specific to or collected by the lead agency, but importantly, it is not only lead agency data. These data could be collected by other government or non-government entities or agencies. So for example, your CCR&Rs might be collecting these data on your behalf. And you will need to obtain those data in order to fill out some of the items on the QPR. For progress update throughout the report, we are asking you about progress updates, and those specifically, this is progress on goals that you specified in the plan. So we've made some tweaks this year, and Sam will talk about those a bit more. But basically, progress is determined by the measurable indicators from the plan for each topic. And we're only looking for your progress specifically for federal fiscal year 2023. So some key dates to remember before we jump in to the content are, you should have received the email with the program instruction and the preprint, and both are available online. The QPR content and technical training is what you're attending right now. And then the submission site we are targeting that to be open by Friday on October 13th. And then finally, important to remember is that the QPR is always due on the last day of the calendar year, December 31st, this year, 2023. So now we're going to jump into the QPR and the content itself. So there is an introduction to the QPR, and it discusses the purpose, the data to be used and collected, which I already discussed before, how the QPR is organized, and includes the timelines necessary. It also helpfully includes a glossary of terms. And if a term is not listed in the glossary, states and territories should use their own definition for that term. One major change that we made is we worked with our technical assistance partners and clarified the definition of staff family childcare network. So you'll see here on the slide that we have a new definition for what staff family childcare networks means. So the rest of the QPR, specifically sections 2 through 11, are set up in a repetitive manner. There are content questions, there are questions on funds spent on allowable uses, and then there are questions on progress updates. Spending questions, we'll move into a bit more about these in a second. We've included this slide to help folks identify where in the plan you might want to go to reference certain activities that you may or may not have said you were going to engage in, to be able to facilitate your answering some of the questions in the QPR. So this lists out the allowable uses, the associated plan section, and the QPR section. So the form for the changes that we've made to the 2023 QPR for the most part, really focus on structural changes because of the cars, because of cars. So the content really hasn't changed. What we've done is we've kind of reconfigured the spending questions. We've added some hopefully helpful things to the progress update questions to help you answer those. We've added one new question on the number of licensing inspectors, but most importantly, we removed many items throughout the QPR. And so what we're going to walk through is all of the items in the QPR, skipping over some that are repetitive. So let me start with the changes that we made for the funds spent on allowable activities. We used to call this spending section. So the main change, so what you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation are screenshots of what the form will look like in CARS. The red text you'll see are some validation messages that may come up depending on how you answer the item. So there are now two types of spending questions, which will hopefully make it easier to provide accurate data. If funds were, so the first type of spending question is what you see on the screen here, and these will pop up on the same page as content questions. And it will be asking you to identify which funding sources were used to engage in that activity. You want to check off the funding source used. So we're not asking you about how much was spent. We're just asking you which funding source. And again, please note that one of those funding sources is non-CCDF funds. Now, if funds were spent, but you are unable to report the source, you can check the unable to report checkbox, but you must then indicate why you can't report the source of the funding. So the second type of spending question you'll see is that will appear similarly to other reports at the end of each of the sections. So this is an example of the spending question for the end of the section 2. And instead of asking you to report on the amount spent by funding source, we used to ask you for each one, we're now just asking about the total amount spent across all funding sources on that allowable use. So on professional in this example, training and professional development. So we're no longer asking you to tease apart the different funding sources. Just tell us how much in total was spent across all funding sources on training and professional development, for example. So one thing to note is that if you check yes on any of these spending questions in the body of the report in the content areas, you're going to be required to answer this question at the end of the section. CARS will be tracking that you said yes and that, and then you will be required to tell us a number for how much was spent for the entire training and professional development topic, for example. If funds were spent, but the lead agent that you're unable to report the dollar amount, there is a checkbox where you would say and check off unable to report, and then tell us why you can't report that overall dollar amount. Again, we're not asking you to break it out by funding source. So another thing to note, and the CARS team will go into a bit more detail on this, but if you answer no to all of the content questions, this spending question is not required. However, you will also not see a little indicator icon, like a check mark saying like, oh, you completed this section when you're navigating through CARS. So that'll make a bit more sense once you dive in and actually see how the report functions. But just a note that that isn't a bug or something wrong. It's just that just won't appear. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Sam.
Thanks, Francesca. Hi, everyone. So we're going to talk about progress updates. So as the last question in sections 2 through 11, you're going to need to report progress. And so in these sections, you're going to describe progress in achieving outcomes in each allowable use or topic. So the topics in 2 through 11, as determined by the measurable indicators that were specified in the 2022-2024 CCDF plan. So we are trying to clarify the connection between what you had reported in your plan and what you're now describing here as your progress and outcomes. And so in order to support that connection, CARS, we have some new functionality in CARS where we're going to be able to import, you're going to see the data that you have from your 2022-2024 plan in the progress update question, and that hopefully will help support you responding to the measurable indicators that you did report in the plan. So we'll see an example of what that looks like on the next slide. Some reminders about the progress update sections. Please include examples, data, and numeric targets where possible. If you cannot describe outcomes or you don't have data to report, please describe the barriers to achieving outcomes or being able to report data in the section. So if you have activities that have changed since the plan, or if the way that you're tracking the data on anything has changed since what you reported in the plan, please use the progress update section to describe that change and then report outcomes accordingly based on how your activities or data have changed. So we're trying to clarify when you are going to be required to report progress. So you will need to report progress if you have activities reported in the plan, so you'll see your response in the plan. If you have activities that have changed since the plan, so maybe you didn't have any activities in any one of the allowable uses, but you've started to since the plan, we'll ask you to report progress based on that update. And then if you're reporting on activities in the QPR, so if you're saying yes to any of the content questions, we'll also ask you to report on progress. So essentially, if you're doing any activities or you're spending quality funds in any of the allowable uses in the QPR, we're going to ask you to report on progress related to that allowable use. You can go to the next slide. So this is what the progress update questions are going to look like in CARS. And so you have kind of the anatomy of the question here. You can see that big block of text in the middle is actually data imported from the 2022-2024 plan. So that is a set response. It's going to be not editable in CARS. It's just kind of there read only for you to see. And then the blank box on the bottom is where you're going to actually report the progress. And hopefully that response from the plan is going to help inform that your response in the QPR. Okay, the next slide. So we wanted to note that it is possible that the data will appear blank or it will say NA like it does here if you did not report anything in the plan. But again, refer back to a couple slides ago in terms of the situations where you would need to report progress, even if it was blank in the plan. If anything has changed, you would still need to report progress. But if you don't have any activities on that topic, then you would not need to report any progress. Next slide. So now we'll start talking about the content sections of the QPR. So in section 1, we talk about the provider population. We've made a couple of changes here. You're no longer going to need to report on the number of licensed exempt or in-home providers. So you're only going to report licensed center-based providers and licensed family childcare providers, which you'll see on the next slide. And we've also taken advantage of some CARS functionality here to import some of the ACF 800 data to again support your response in the QPR. So you can see that here on this slide. I know it's a little bit small, but what you're going to see in CARS for these questions is the data from the federal fiscal year 2022 ACF 800 that shows specifically the number of CCDF licensed center-based and licensed family childcare homes. So right now this is kind of like test data. So it says 5 licensed center-based programs, but this is just test data. And that's going to be the number of CCDF licensed providers. And so we imported that data from the 800 here to help support the response here, which is we're asking for the total number of providers. So not just the CCDF providers, the total number of providers. So the response you're giving in the QPR should be higher, should be more presumably. than what you reported on the 800, which only represents the CCDF providers. So it's just kind of a reference point to help you determine what you're reporting here for the total number of licensed providers. So we have in the glossary and on this slide the definition of licensed in case you want to reference that to determine who you're counting here and who you're reporting. Okay, next slide. And I'm turning it back to you.
Sorry, I had to get myself off mute. So we'll be jumping into now the first of the allowable uses. And so each of the sections will map onto that. I'm not going to go over the summary of changes, but the first slides in all of these sections tell you what has changed from last year's QPR, and also identifies which items funding must be reported for. So jumping right in to the first items in section 2. We're asking you about your professional development register and registry. Sorry. And in 2.1.1, if you answer yes that you have a workforce registry or professional development registry, you're going to have to describe what that is. And similarly, if you answer no, you also have to describe why you don't have one, or how you track progression of professional development in your state. For 2.1.2, we ask if there are any teachers or providers required to participate. If you answer yes on this item, please identify who is required to participate. And then in 2.1.3, you will be asked for the total number of participants. So this includes across all teachers, whoever is included in your registry, we want that number, what that number is. And so all of these items are going to appear on the same page, along with, as you see here, the spending question, where we're asking you if the funds from any sources were related. So I'm going to keep, you'll see this appear on certain content questions. I'm going to skip talking about this from here on out. So the next section of section 2, we're asking you about workforce development, specifically professional development and career pathways support. So here we're looking for any activities and numbers of teachers connected to professional development and career pathways, and if you support those through a variety of ways, so either scholarships, financial bonuses, career advisors, etc. And then general provider compensation and benefits. So something we used to ask about in this section, we've actually moved to section 11. So you won't see that here. So this is very specific to supporting professional development and career pathways. And just a note here that a lot of states and territories may contract out for some of these activities. And so you may have to go to a third party to get the data that you need for this. The next set of items ask about the number of licensed childcare programs and their qualifications. So the first item here asks about total number of licensed CCF programs with certain credentials. And then the second item here asks about the number of licensed CCDF specifically. There is no funding source question for this item. The next set of questions ask about technical assistance specifically for professional development. And so here you just check off what types of professional development are available. If you select other, you must describe what the other forms of technical assistance are. Then here is the spending item. So just to flag here, if you check yes in any of those items on the screen, you must report this item. And then here is what the progress update will look like. And moving on to section 3. So section 3, the allowable use associated here is about early learning and development guidelines. So this section used to have a question about if there were any changes to your early learning and development guidelines. That is no longer a question in the section. We are only asking you here about spending. And so again, we'll ask you what were funds spent on early learning development guidelines, and if so, how much across all funding sources, and then a progress update about early learning development guidelines. That's it for section 3, just about spending and progress update. Section 4 aligns with the allowable use for quality rating improvement system or other transparent system of quality indicators. Here, there's been significant restructuring of the section. So you'll notice that. So starting here, what we did here was collapse and combine a lot of questions into one. So for those of you familiar with prior iterations of this report, you used to there was a separate question on the number of centers and homes that met high quality definition. Similarly, there was a separate question on the total number of CCF providers and also the total number of children served. We are now, depending on your answer to section 4, you would tell us all that information in 4.1 in that item. So we're just kind of moving the where you tell us things around. So if you select that you have a QRIS operating state or territory wide, you must give us a description of that, how many tiers or levels, how many licensed childcare centers, licensed family childcare homes, and CCF providers participate, specifically under the high quality definition, and then also how many children served by providers meeting the high quality definition. So very specifically to those providers meeting the high quality definition, we want numbers. And so once you tell us how many levels or tiers are in your QRIS, additional boxes will pop up where we would like a brief description of that tier level. So for example, if you have 2 tiers and the first one is, star 1, and just give us a brief sentence about what star 1 means. And then you must check off which one of your tiers meets high quality. So the rest of these are going through the other options for this item 4.1.1. So if you have a QRIS, but it's only operating at a pilot level, not state or territory wide, we're going to ask you all the same questions as we did for the other response option, but we're also going to ask you what localities is it operating in, if not state or territory wide. The next option under this item is that you are operating some other system of quality improvement. And again, we're still going to ask all the same questions with 2 differences. One being we're going to ask you to describe any assessment scores, accreditation, or other metrics associated with the system, and also how you define high quality in this system. So you won't be breaking out tiers here, but we still are asking for a just definition of high quality, as well as numbers of providers and children participating under that high quality definition. And then finally, and here you can see what the question will look like as you're answering it, or when it first appears on the screen for you all. And the final option here is you do not have a QRIS that is operating, but we then will ask you if you have a definition of high quality and for you to provide that.
Francesca, in the chat, someone just was clarifying in terms of the definition of high quality. Is this something we define in the glossary, or is this something the state will define? And so I put in the chat, and we can clarify that for each of these options, it's the state or territory that's going to define high quality based on what it is in their state or territory.
Thank you, Sam. That's very helpful. And there is an associated spending question with this item. Next item asks which providers types of providers participate in your QRIS. If you do not have a QRIS, you can just answer other and just say we do not have a QRIS. For the next set of items, again, this is an area where we collapsed a bunch of questions into one. So we used to ask what type of financial incentives or technical assistance is available. We're still asking that. So you check off which ones are available, either one-time grants, ongoing or periodic quality stipends, higher CCDF subsidy rates. And under those three, if you select them, you must tell us how many licensed childcare centers or how many licensed family childcare homes. Again, here, licensed is key, that participate or got that benefit. And then if you check off ongoing assistance, there is no numbers associated for that. This is the end of section. So again, this is across all sources, across all activities in QRIS and the progress update. Section 5, we're asking about infants and toddler programs. The first item here asks if providers have access to infant toddler specialists. And we're looking for any professionals that operate in your state that provide or territory that provide specialized services to support the care of infants and toddlers. And then we're asking you how many of them are there. If you don't have information there, these fields are text fields, so you can tell us why you don't have that information or that you don't have that information, but we are looking for a number. So if you answered yes, in this 5.1.1, you will be required to answer this item 5.1.2 about what supports those specialists that you identified in the first item provide. And then there's a spending question. So the next set of questions is about the number and description of staff family childcare network. So here we're asking you, using that new definition from the glossary of terms, how many staff family childcare networks are there, and a description of. And then that's it. So we eliminated a lot of questions from section 5. So then here's spending and progress updates. And then we're on to section 6. Section 6 is a lot like section 3 in that we had one item that we eliminated. And so now in section 6, we're just asking you if you spent funds towards a CCR&Rs and progress update. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam for the rest of the sections.
Thanks. So in section 7, we're asking about how you used quality funds to facilitate compliance with health, safety, licensing standards. We've removed a number of questions in this section, which you'll see on alignment of standards and also complaints. And then we did add one very simple question on the number of licensing inspectors. You can go to the next slide. So the first question is just the total, asking for the total number of complaints that were received in federal fiscal year 23. So you'll enter the number in that box and then tell us if you've spent any funds on that. And here we just clarified that those funds could be anything that supported the intake of a complaint. So to support a complaint hotline or staff that manage that intake process. This is the new question that we've added to the QPR, and it asks how many licensing staff positions were there in the state or territory. We know that the scope of licensing staff can be very different in each state and territory. So we've clarified here that the number we're looking for is the total number of licensing staff in the field that conduct the routine inspections. So the ones out there doing your annual visits. So those are the number of staff that we're looking for there. And then you'll let us know if you spent any funds. And just to note here, in terms of the CCDF funds, we're only looking for regular CCDF quality funds. And then all of these other streams. But if you were, have non-direct funds or admin funds that you spent on this, you don't need to report those here. Next slide. And then this question is about how many childcare programs received coaching or technical assistance specifically as a result of an inspection visit or violations that they received. So you'll enter just the total number of programs that received either coaching or TA. And again, it's really specific to based on an inspection or violations. And you'll tell us about the funding that supported that activity. And then next slide. So this is the overall spending question and the progress update question for section 7. Section 8.
Sam, before we move on, I noticed there's a question in the chat about for 7.1, the complaints received, is this just substantiated complaints? And the answer there is no, we're just asking for all complaints that were asked, that were called into any hotline or that you received.
Thank you. I just saw another question come in. Should we check that one out?
Let's move on and then
Okay, we can read it. Okay, so section 8 is about evaluating and assessing the quality of childcare programs. We asked specifically about licensed center-based programs and licensed family childcare in this section. We've added some check boxes here to try to clarify the measures or tools that are used. So we can go to the next slide. And you can see some of these check boxes. So this is really a check all that apply situation in these sections. So anything that applies can be checked. And we noticed we used the ERS to cover both the ECHRS, the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale, and the SACRS, the School Age Care Environment Rating Scale. So if you've used either of those in center-based programs, you can check off that ERS box. And we also have QRIS here. So if you have evaluation and assessment components of your QRIS, even if they are also some of these tools, you can check both the tools and the QRIS. And if you check off state evaluation tool or other, you'll need to describe both of those responses. And then you'll report on your spending here. And then you can go to the next slide. So this is the same question, but for family childcare programs. So again, check all that apply. That could be QRIS and or the tools. And then you'll have to describe if you check state evaluation tool or other. And then you'll report on spending. So this is the overall spending and the progress update for section 8. Section 9, there were no changes. This is about supporting the voluntary pursuit of accreditation. So if you do support the voluntary pursuit of accreditation, you'll say yes here, and then we are asking you to report the number of programs that you've supported. We know you may only support some provider types and not all. So if you don't support any of these provider types, you can use the number box to say something like did not support this provider type or include some NA there or something, but include the numbers for the ones that you have supported. And then this is the overall spending question for that section. And there is also a progress question. Section 10 is about supporting the development or adoption of high quality program standards. And similar to section 8, we've added some checkboxes here to clarify what we're looking for in terms of the high quality program standards. So you can go to the next slide. So you'll see these checkboxes here. So the QRIS option, if you check that, has a number of nested quality indicator topics. So if you check QRIS, we're asking you to check at least one of these topics, which could be other. And if you do check other, you would need to describe. And then if you check state framework or other kind of in those overall checkboxes, you'll need to describe your responses there as well. The next one is a spending question for this section, and then there is the overall progress update for this section. So section 11 is kind of our catch-all section. This is other activities to improve the quality of childcare services. So the question that was moved from section 2 that Francesca mentioned is now going to be in this section. And we've removed a number of questions in this section, so you no longer have to report on emergent health and safety needs, or diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, or on general provider supports. So you can go to the next slide. So we are still asking if you've provided stabilization or sustainability grants to providers. And the key with this question is that we're asking for you to report anything that was funded with funds other than the ARP stabilization funds. So we don't want you to report on ARP Act stabilization fund grants here. This is if you've done any other types of stabilization grants or activities that used the other funding sources. So then you would describe that here, and you would check off the provider types that were eligible for those grants or initiatives, and include the number that were supported. If you don't have a number, you can indicate that here or use the other to explain. And then you'll report funding that supported that activity. Next slide. So this was a question that was present in last year's QPR. It's about data systems investments. So if you've used any funds to support data systems, you'll say yes and describe that here. And so we have some examples of data systems that might be applicable here. So this is not a comprehensive list, but I think these examples, for example, childcare subsidy systems or your QRIS system, even a background check system, these examples were intending to show you that this is a broad scope and it's really any data system that touches the many facets of your childcare system in the state or territory. So you'll describe that here and then describe funding. The next question is if you've conducted an analysis of supply and demand, and this can be limited in scope, so it doesn't have to be a comprehensive analysis. If you did one of just infant toddler slots, for example, you could describe that here. So if you did an analysis, you'll describe it and then report the funding. And then kind of a companion question, if you've implemented any initiatives designed to increase or address the supply and demand issues in the state or territory, specifically that address these populations, all you'll do is check off these boxes here if you've done initiatives that support these populations, and you can check off other and describe some other initiatives related to supply and demand. And then you'll report on the spending. So this is the question that was moved from section 2 that's about compensation and benefits for teachers and providers. So you'll check off any of the relevant activities that you did, and you'll have to enter the total number of teachers or providers that were supported with that activity. And if you don't have that data, again, you can enter something like data not available in that box, but you can still check it off. And then if you check off other or NA, you'll have to describe your responses and then report on the spending. This is the overall spending question for section 11, and then there is also a progress update question. And then section 12 is your annual, so it's a slightly different section than the other ones. This is just your annual report section. And you'll see the 2 questions here, and we have some considerations that I won't read on the slide, but some considerations to think about as you're answering these questions and telling us about how you handle your annual review and assessment of serious injuries and deaths occurring in childcare programs. And then the last section of the QPR is still the section on ARP Act stabilization grants, but it is significantly abridged. And we actually have taken out one of the questions from last year, so you no longer need to report on the methods to eliminate fraud. So the first question in section 13 is, did you run multiple grant programs? This could be multiple rounds of a grant program or multiple distinct grant programs. So you'll describe that here. And then the second and final question is if you've used your stabilization grants to support workforce compensation in any of these ways. You can check off other. If you required a specific percentage or amount of the grants, we ask you to just tell us what percentage or amount that was. So those are the sections. We have some general guidance here around the time frame. So remember that this covers specifically the time frame of federal fiscal year 23. We've said this throughout, but in sections 2 through 11, we want you to report on all CCDF and non-CCDF funding sources, except for the ARP Act stabilization grants, the 90% of that funding that was specifically for grants. You don't need to report on that in sections 2 through 11. In general, please spell out your acronyms, especially state or territory specific acronyms that may not be widely known. And then the QPR is submitted via the CARS submission site, and that is a lovely segue to turn to Rosa, who's going to talk to us more about CARS. So Rosa.
And I will, yes, definitely turn it to Rosa, but I also want to say the other 2 questions we got in the chat relate to kind of how to parse out funding and the amount that we're looking for. So we'll turn to that at the end. And if we don't get to that question, those questions at the end, we will make sure that it's very clear in the slides and additional guidance.
Great.
Great. I am going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Let me know, do you see it?